Okay, welcome. Take it away, Kendra.
Okay, hi. Thanks for having me, folks. My name is Kendra Brewer. I'm here from Southwest Seed. We are a family-owned business that's been in the area since the late 70s, and we're located between Cortez and Dolores. So I'm just going to be, I'll go through a PowerPoint slide tonight, but I want there to be plenty of time for questions so that we can, discuss what your needs are for tonight. So, as Ashley said, you can go ahead and put the questions. You can write them out, or we will have some time at the end to have a discussion as well. Okay, so to take it away, let me make sure I'm get my technical base covered here. Okay, so for those of you who who don't know Southwest Seed, we have two locations. We are a seed company that both grows seed, specializing in native varieties of plants and flowers and forbs. We grow those out on our farm out in Pleasant View, which is a 700-acre farm. What you're seeing on the far left side of the screen is a field of Utah sweet vetch, which perhaps can be seen from space, we think, when it's in full bloom. It's pretty awesome. So in addition to growing a lot of native seeds, we also have a facility to clean seeds and store seeds, and then we sell a whole variety of seeds beyond just the natives that we're able to grow in this area. That facility is the one that's located between Dolores and Cortez on Road 29. So if you're coming to visit us at the office, this is where you'll come. And so we clean and store seed, as I said, and then the kinds of seeds that we sell, in addition to native grasses and forbs, include, cover crops, pasture grasses, lawn grasses, wildflowers, most kinds of seed varieties except for garden vegetables, essentially. So we serve, homeowners such as yourself, landscaping companies, folks that do reclamation work. So if somebody's doing some drilling, they have to go back and actually, reseed the ground after they're done there. And then we also have lots for, pasture grasses and other kinds of agricultural needs. So tonight we'll be kind of going through, there's a lot of information to know if you are going to be seeding an area. It's hard to account for every factor of a natural system, but a basic grasp of your options will definitely increase your odds of success dramatically. And I say odds because it is always a gamble. If you're seeding in dryland, it's 1 in 3 gamble pretty often. Your odds can be a bit higher if you're seeding in an irrigated system, but we'll talk about some of the things that can help you increase those odds for sure. So those things include, what to plant, when to plant it, and how to do it. So maybe you'll get some slightly better answers than a crazy 8-ball. So am I correct in assuming that most of your land holdings are like about 3 acres? Is that pretty typical?
So it kind of varies. There's some that are definitely bigger, but some smaller, about 3 acres is probably, I guess. Okay. It really depends on the subdivision, but anywhere up from that to maybe more like 10 or 15 probably for most. Okay.
So I think most of what we'll talk about today can be applied at that scale as well. There's a huge variety of scales that you might be seeding at, so your considerations are slightly different for those. But let's first, talk about why bother seeding. As our Gary Larson notes here, nature abhors a vacuum. So a lot of folks know that, if they don't cover that bare ground that was just exposed when you had to remove some trees to do thinning around your property, you might run into erosion issues, some weed issues. But you also, there's a lot of benefits that come from seeding, including habitat for local wildlife and including pollinators and things of that nature. And obviously it's beauty that we're all really drawn to. Sometimes you're not just covering bare ground. You might want to replace your existing vegetation, For instance, if you have, Kentucky bluegrass lawn and, in our dry area, you realize you might be better served by more of a dryland type turf grass. That would be a common reason to replace that existing vegetation. And then for everybody in this group here, flammability is obviously a major concern. So we'll talk a little bit about that tonight as well. Okay, next. So let's begin with what you might consider planting. There's a lot of categories in the world of seeds that you might not be aware exist. And so when you call us to get a recommendation on what to plant, we're going to ask you questions to help determine which categories will be most suitable for your needs. So that first category that you really should be aware of is cool season versus warm season. So we're going to go through everything in here and in the coming slides. So let's forward to the next one. Okay, so what's a cool season grass and a warm season grass? Basically, there's some grasses that in fact, I would say the majority of grasses around us are cool season grasses. They will tend to green up earlier in the spring. They tend to go dormant if they're not watered during the summer, which means they'll brown up for a little bit, but then they'll start growing again in the fall when the weather cools off a little bit, and they'll be the plants that are more green up until winter. They tend to germinate in cool-ish weather soils, not cold, but cool. And then we've got warm season grasses, which like an example of that would be blue grama, for instance. That is something that's going to stay brown and dormant until much later in the spring or even the early summer. But then it's going to be green and doing most of its growing during the heat of the year, during the summertime. And then it's going to go dormant a bit earlier again in the fall than your cool season grasses. So in really higher elevation areas, you have a shorter window of green with your warm season grasses. So you're going to want to be aware of that. If you're seeding a lawn above 7,000 feet, you're going to probably want to go with a cool season grass rather than a warm season grass so that you get the longest possible period of green up on your area. So the next category that we're looking at is it a bunching grass or a spreading grass? In our area, bunching grasses are by far the most common grasses that we see around us. So that's basically, the grasses that they have like a single little hillock, and that they're wonderful and they have a lot of benefits. However, folks can get a little tripped up in that they make the geography a little bit uneven, or the land, it makes it a little bit uneven. Whereas the spreading grass, such as the smooth brome that you see here, tends to be a more flat, even surface. That's one that's easier to drive an ATV across or, just walk across, really. But both types have their benefits. You just need to be aware that, those differences exist. The next category of vegetation you want to consider is it a grass you're dealing with at all, or is it a broadleaf or a forb? So things that flower tend to be the broadleaves. A lot of broadleaves in this area are warm season. When we talk about flowers and wildflowers, they're going to tend to be warm season, but some do like it a little bit colder. The reason you really want to understand this difference is, one is if you're using any herbicides, you will want to be aware of herbicide interactions. You may need to wait to add your broadleaves or your wildflowers to an area if you plan to be using herbicides for weed control in the first few years of your planting. And then grasses are a great base for larger areas. You wouldn't really want to do just like, an acre of straight wildflowers. You definitely want grasses in there. Yeah. Okay, so around here, a really important division is dryland versus irrigated plants. The thing you want to be really clear about, especially if you're, surfing around online and trying to figure out what, grasses or forbs are best for your area, is that dryland in the Four Corners region is dramatically different than dryland in Ohio. So sometimes you'll read something online that says, this fescue is a great dryland plant. It might well be a dryland plant in Ohio, but out here, it's going to need some supplemental water to perform perform the way that you want it to. So dryland just means you're not adding supplemental water. Irrigated, could be sprinklers, or if there's any number of ways to get water on the land. It could be furrow watering, but you really want to be aware if the seed that you're planting is going to need that supplemental moisture, even if it's just for a little part of the year. If it needs it during that little part of the year, then you want to make sure you have the water available to plant it. Some things to note is that dryland turf grasses are an available option. And if you came from another part of the country, you may not be aware of that. And then another thing to consider is if you're planting flowers anywhere, that you're always going to get more blooms on your flowers if you are able to give them supplemental water in our region. Okay, so the next category is kind of a big one and kind of a fascinating one. When we talk about native plants versus introduced plants, we're basically talking about, the native plants are the ones that were here before Europeans arrived. We'll talk about the advantages and disadvantages of both. So some of the benefits of native plants is that they're adapted to local conditions. They evolved here. So they tend to grow better with less management. They can be suitable for our thinner soils, our low water needs, especially. The local microbiome, things that might not, be super obvious at first. They tend to be very good neighbors to local flora and fauna. So the ecosystem roles that they play can be really important. Pollinator interactions with a lot of plants can be very specialized. And if they don't have that specific flora available, then, that population might not do so well. Root systems that tend to match local conditions is a great consideration. So this slide shows, the difference in what's going on underground, those things that we don't see very readily. And for our native plants in this area, they tend to have some pretty deep roots because that's how they manage to be drought tolerant, or that's one of the mechanisms that makes them drought tolerant. If, the top, foot of soil is dried out, but you've got, some water deeper underground, the plants with those really long root systems are going to have a great advantage over the plants that just have short root systems because they evolved in a different place that they didn't need those long roots. Let's see. Generally, though, natives can be, some are and some aren't, they can be relatively slow to germinate and grow. So that can be a disadvantage against weed competition. There are a few species that establish faster than others, slender wheatgrass or mountain broom, for example. And those can be really great for erosion control. It's best to include those types of species in your plantings if you're planting a mix of natives. You're going to get just better results if you make that consideration. And then you can also plant a nurse crop to hold the ground and protect those slower growing species. So a nurse crop is typically an annual, and annuals tend to jump up and get going really fast because they don't have a lot of time to, get established and to set their seed and kind of make their mark. So they can, as they're growing up there, they're actually creating a microclimate that's going to be more favorable to those slower growing perennials that you're trying to grow. So natives they tend to best be used for reclamation. So actually, areas that have been, are being renaturalized. Xeriscape because of those tendencies to be pretty drought tolerant and, adapted to local water conditions. They're great for creating beautiful meadows. Like there's some really beautiful native grass mixes out there. You can use them for low water lawns and pollinator zones, all good uses. For introduced species, some have been introduced intentionally and some have not. So a lot of them tend to have faster establishment and growth, which makes them really useful for pasture and agricultural kind of purposes that can be very useful in weed control. However, some of those plants might need more system inputs. They might need more water. They might need more nutrient enrichment. They might, have evolved in areas where there's just a lot greater fertility. And then so I guess examples can be helpful here. So Kentucky bluegrass is an example of an introduced species that needs those greater inputs. It's got really short roots. It needs lots of water. It needs to be fertilized if you want to have your bluegrass lawn. But then there's other species that can be really aggressive for local flora and fauna. So crested wheatgrass is an example of that. Crested wheatgrass is incredibly useful for the, for areas that if you've got a lot of weeds, it can be very competitive against those weeds, which is great. But it can also be aggressive in ways that can kind of box out local flora as well. And it doesn't necessarily have like the wide ecosystem benefits that some other grasses might have. Okay, so it's hard because I can't see anybody's faces right now. So I just want to do a quick check-in, make sure I'm not talking too fast and the pace and everything seems okay.
Yes, I think you're doing great.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so next category is, I mentioned earlier perennials versus annuals. So it's really important to know, what you're putting down there. It'd be really disappointing to put annuals, which are, they only last 1 to 5 seasons before they set seed and then die back. Be really sad if you planted an area with only annuals, expecting them to live for many, many years. Annuals obviously have a lot of benefits, though, being that they're fast growing, and that they can hold territory really well, and they can be really great for a lot of agricultural purposes. And then there's just a lot of really pretty annual flowers as well. Perennials are they're any plant that's going to last more than 5 seasons, and that could be anywhere from 1 year to 40 years. Some are even more. They are great in that you don't have to keep planting them, and they're going to tend to be less management overall. But it takes some time for them to establish, generally like 2 years with most of the grasses and the forbs that you would consider planting from seed. So be aware of that. That needs to be part of your management strategy. Another great benefit or just another consideration with perennials is that they tend in our area to have deeper roots, and that helps to create a more intact soil system. In agricultural production, where in the type of, like, say if you're row cropping or something and you have to be reseeding every year, maybe multiple times a year, you're gonna have a lot of disturbance in your soil, and that's going to have some effects on the quality of your soil, and we'll talk about that a little bit in slides to come. Okay, so you all of course are very interested in firewise planting. And I assume that everybody here is aware that there are certain types of plants that are better suited for zones 1 and 2 of your property. So for mostly what we'll talk about right now is really for that 30 feet kind of distance from your structures. And CSU is usually where I go for information on, firewise plantings in our area. And you can just Google CSU extension fact sheet. And you can even just type in the 6.3.5 to, if you want to see this fact sheet that they have as well. So these low flammability plants, the plants that are recommended for as firewise are low flammability don't have low flammability, and they also have high rebound from fire events. So those are 2 different things. One is it's a high flammability plant like cheatgrass is a problem because it's going to cause fire, but then there's other kinds of plants that will bounce back okay from fire. And you want both of those qualities. So the low flammability plants, they tend to be lower growing and have a more compact form. They also tend to have less oil or resin content. So like resin, pine tree is a high resin plant, for example. These plants tend to have high moisture, so think succulents, for example. And it's good to know that, different plants will have different moisture profiles at different times in the year. The cool season dryland grass is going to go dormant during the height of fire season, meaning it's going to lose moisture. You'll see it kind of brown up. So that's going to make those cool season dryland grasses, might, depending on your elevation and a bunch of other factors, you might want to be aware that they might be more flammable during the height of fire season. And yeah, you're even more than that, you can manage them. So you just want to mow them to reduce your fire danger during that period. Okay, next. So a lot of native options tend to be pretty fire-wise, it turns out. Reasons being that there's less excessive growth for plants native to our region. And that has to do a little bit with the drought tolerance and the lack of water. That's going to inhibit, expansive growth. They tend to have better rebound from fire, and I think that just has to do with them, evolving in a fire ecology. And then there tends to be this correspondence of drought tolerance and salt tolerance to fire resistance. That's not fully understood, but there's some overlapping characteristics that make that correspondence pretty typical. Generally speaking, no matter what kind of situation you're planting for, except for a lawn, usually, diversity is best. So if you're able to find a mix that has all of the attributes that you need, that's a wonderful thing. So I will share a copy with Ashley of Southwest Seeds mixes. We have this big packet that's got, 20 some odd mixes in it that are made specifically for our region. And it goes, anywhere from long grasses and pasture grasses to native mixes for varying elevations, wildflower mixes, cover crop, etc. And it just so happens that our Foothills native mix happens to be a great option if you're looking for something to plant firewise in our region, anywhere from, I'd say 5,000 all the way up to 9,000 feet. It would be pretty darn suitable for. It's got good fire resistance. It's good for erosion control. It's got some of that slender wheatgrass we talked about being one of those fast growing native grasses. And yeah, so it will start holding ground relatively soon. Good for erosion control. This is a dryland native mix that is alkali tolerant. It can be planted on like Mancos shale sites. It's adapted to clay. Yeah, I mean, these are the plants that we see growing around us when we walk out into nature in our area. And I happen to think they're all pretty beautiful. If you've all seen Indian rice grass, it can be pretty darn lovely. And that's actually Indian rice grass on the far left there. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about some seeding basics, and then we'll talk about like how to plant, when to plant, and those kinds of things. So real quick, when you buy a bag of seed from us, this is a seed tag that you're going to get on that bag. And by law, there are certain things that need to be on there, and those tell you the quality of the seed that you're getting. So the first thing is the lot number. So the lot is basically like, usually that lot was all grown in the same field, but not always. But it's been cleaned together and stored together, and every seed, all of the seed that comes from that lot should have the same purity and germination characteristics. So for what that is, we look at the purity analysis, which if you look at that number 2 box, that top number, the pure, is basically just the percentage of seed that is actually seed. It's not, there might in that bag of seed also be some pieces of stem or leaves or chaff, things that are inert. They're not going to do anything, but they're not going to like become a plant. There might also be some seeds from weed plants or from other crop seeds that are in the mix because it was just too hard to separate them from that seed that you actually purchased. So you want to know how much of that bag of seed is actually seed. The next thing you want to know is how much of that pure seed is actually alive and viable and going to actually have the potential to grow into a plant. So that's what that germination box is. Germination and TZ are two ways to get at this same information. Excuse me. So if you see a TZ number, that's essentially the same as a germ number. And then knowing your germ and knowing your purity, you can multiply those together to figure out what's called your pure live seed, meaning what percentage of what's in that bag has the potential to become a plant. And that is PLS for short in the industry there. And the thing to know is that germination can be variable over time. A bag of seed from 20 years ago is probably going to be a lot less viable than seed that's, from the last couple of years. So every year we're required by law to test this seed to make sure that the germination, the number that's reflected on that tag is what you're actually getting today. And on that note, just note that to improve the viability of your seed over time, if you have to keep your seed in storage, that's fine. A lot of seeds will keep their viability for many, many years. You can help improve that viability by keeping the seed in a cool, dry place where rodents and insects can't get to it. So don't keep it in your hot car. That's going to start killing off those live little seeds. And obviously don't put it somewhere wet because that's going to kind of start a whole bad process. And then the last thing to know on this is that you can, in fact, buy your seed by a PLS weight instead of a bulk weight. So you can get 1 pound bulk, which, you'll might be 87%, pure seed. In this case of the slide that we're looking at, there's the pure live is 76% of that 1 pound is actually, viable seed. So if you're trying to plan or figure out how much seed you need, you can ask us to determine a PLS weight. That way, you know that you're planting as much of that seed as you need to actually get the germination rate that you want. Okay. All right. Okay. So the next thing just to know real quick is you want to be aware that different situations have different seeding rates. So don't seed everything as thickly as you would seed a lawn. You don't need to know much beyond that. Just be aware that you're not going to seed everything that thickly. Seeding rates are influenced by your seed size, the PLS, how much of that bag is actually, potentially going to germinate, your water availability, your mix composition. There's a lot of factors that go into it. So we will, calculate that for you and tell you how much seed you're going to need to seed a specific area. And don't be surprised if your dryland pasture, is going to need a lot less seed per acre than a lawn is going to. Oh yeah, and the other thing is, a lot of you may not have access to, say, a drill. Drilling is like a method of seeding with kind of heavy machinery. You need a tractor and you pull this drill along and it places the seed very precisely. And so you don't need as much seed if you're able to drill the seed as if you're broadcasting the seed, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Okay, so when to plant is, I think, a big question for a lot of folks. There's a lot of options available. If you have bare ground, typically you are going to want to get that ground covered, so you might not get the opportunity to wait for your ideal time to plant. But if you have the choice as to when you're going to be planting, when you're going to be able to, turn things over, it's good to know what the options are. So right now we are in winter, and believe it or not, you can go ahead and plant some seed right now. If you've got a lot of snow in your area because you're higher elevation right now, that's fine. You can actually do a winter dormant seeding on top of the snow, and over time that seed will make its way into the ground. And when when the soil warms up enough and when it has enough water in the spring, your seeds can sprout. You can also, of course, do a spring planting, which is, I think, what most people think about when they think about when to plant. And that can be just fine, but be aware that you never want to plant when your soil is very wet. And springtime does tend to be a wetter time. So be aware that you're going to cause a lot of damage to your soil if you go out and try to plant into a wet field, or try to plant into wet soil. And then the other times to think about is you can plant through the summer for a lot of warm season crops. And you can plant all the way up till early fall in a lot of instances. So actually around here, a really great time to plant a dryland area is actually going to be in the late summer monsoon season. And that is because the temperature and the moisture tends to be about right for things to germinate. And then it still gives the plants a couple of months to establish before winter comes on, so that your seedings will survive the winter. And then they'll be ready to green up that much earlier in the spring. So if you can do a late summer, early fall planting, I highly recommend it. And to be more specific, that's usually like towards the end of August, the beginning of September. There is a couple of months. So as we start to get towards like the end of September, October, November, that tends to, the end of September and October tend to be a bad time to plant, because if your seeds do germinate, then they may not have enough time to establish before winter comes, and they're just not hardy enough to survive the winter in that case. So tend to avoid trying to plant things in late September and October. But if you wait until November, when it's too cold for things to germinate, then you're essentially entering the winter dormant seeding period again. Okay. So how to figure out the best time for your situation. Keep in mind, germination period varies dramatically between like 5 and 30 days during the proper season. So as you can see on the sheet here, that say Kentucky bluegrass, it needs the ground to be between 50 and 65 degrees, and it could take up to 4 weeks for that seed to actually germinate. It doesn't tend to be the case, but it can certainly be the case. Whereas if you planted, like, say, a cover crop or an annual species that's not on this list here, you're gonna, if you planted annual rye, you might start to see that within the first week for sure. So your introduced and your annual varieties tend to germinate faster than your native and perennial varieties. For when to plant, if you are dryland, I mentioned that I like that late summer, early fall monsoon season. But if you miss that, a winter application is actually a pretty good time to do it, because hopefully it does not happen this way every year, but the hope is that by the time the soil warms up enough in the spring, there's all that moisture from the snow melt still available to those plants to help them germinate and to thrive and to set those roots. So early fall is great, or winter it is the next best. And then if it has to be spring or summer, so be it. Maybe that'll work out great too. It's always a gamble, remember. For irrigation, you are more flexible for sure. But I like to advise waiting until your water is available. So, if you're planting a cool season grass and you're not going to get your irrigation water until, May or June, which does happen some years for some systems, you run the risk of those seeds germinating, but then not having enough water to support root development. So I'd say don't risk it. Just wait until your water comes on, and then you can get everything to germinate then anyway. Okay, so plant varieties are another consideration. Sometimes there's a thing called vernalization that some plants really like to have before they'll germinate. So Indian rice grass is one of those native grasses that they'll tend to get much better germination rates after that seed has sat out in the freezing cold, wet, that process actually helps to soften hard seed. And so a lot of wildflowers will get better germination after they've been hanging outside all winter. So that's just something to be aware of sometimes. And then, for cheatgrass management, that's something that is surely, something you all need to be aware of. If you have cheatgrass, winter and spring plantings are at a disadvantage where that cheatgrass is established. As you may know, cheatgrass is an annual, but it germinates in the fall, and then it grows very, very early in the spring before most intentional plantings will germinate. So it's got the jump on everything else, and it uses up all the available water, and creates other changes in the soil that will keep the other plants from going. So if you have a cheatgrass issue, I wouldn't try to plan for a spring germination. I don't think it's probably not going to work out very well for you. You do better waiting until after the cheatgrass has gone dormant and you can mow it before trying to get your intended plants to germinate. Okay, and then the other consideration is, do you have warm season or cool season plants? They're going to germinate at different soil temperatures. And when we're talking soil temperature, that's where the soil on average, say over the course of a week, nighttime and daytime temperatures is going to be in that range. That's what, that range of 45 to 55 degrees means for the cool season grasses. So they're going to tend to start germinating a little earlier in spring, kind of like mid-spring for most cases. And then they can often continue to germinate through the summer, but some of them don't like it too hot. So spring and fall is kind of like their sweet spot for germination. And then the warm season grasses, you can go ahead and winter seed a warm season grass. It's just not going to come up until probably close to summer. So just be aware of that. And then it's going to be able to germinate all the way through midsummer. But you don't want to seed into late summer on your warm season plants because they won't have enough time to establish and become hardy before the cold weather turns them dormant again. Okay. All right, so before we discuss how to sow the seed, let's ask what are the basic needs for germ growth? So your very first thing is you need good seed, like that seed tag that talking about the pure live seed. Water is it's critical. You won't get any germination without it. And then soil temperature, as we just discussed, is also a critical factor. So there's no point in watering your winter dormant seeds until the soil warms up enough for germination to be possible, which is great. And that means less management. Okay, so there's some other things that we need to be aware of too, because to keep the water and that soil temperature, to keep the temperature in the water consistent around the seed to get our best germination, we're going to want to be aiming to plant our seeds 1/4 to 1/2 inch deep. That's a generalization, but for most of the types of seeds that you all are going to be planting, that's going to be the case. You're not planting corn here, so you don't need to go, an inch or so below the soil. If you do that, you're not going to get good germination. But if you just scatter your seeds on top of the soil and don't get any coverage at all, that's a very exposed seed. There's nothing there to hold moisture around the seed, and there's nothing there to buffer the temperature fluctuations that are going to happen. So that 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch it makes all the difference when it comes to your germination success. So yeah, none of us do live in the perfect world. We aim for the best we can manage, and we'll talk about how to try to aim for the best there. So to get good and resilient growth, we need healthy living soil. So I just want to introduce you all to some of the concepts or the principles of soil health to kind of have them in the back of your mind as you're figuring out your game plan and your strategy. So what is healthy living soil? It's soil that is not just the mineral content that we might find in subsoil. It's not just clay, or, you know, clay, sand, or loam. It's got organic matter and soil organisms, and it has pockets of air that allow for, you know, oxygen movement and water movement, and for the roots to actually be able to penetrate into, meaning that there's not, you know, a ton of compaction. These are all the characteristics of topsoil. And be aware that topsoil is different than subsoil. If you're doing any, if you're doing any building, or if you're going to be moving a lot of soil on your property, do be careful that your topsoil is held separate from your subsoil, and that the topsoil goes back into place afterwards. Otherwise, you have subsoil, which does not have that same biological activity. It's not going to have the same characteristics that the plants really need to be able to thrive and do well. So be sure, and don't assume that your contractor knows to do that. I can't tell you how many don't have any clue about it. So kind of make sure whoever's doing things knows that's really important for you. Okay, so the actual principles themselves. Let's start with maximize living roots. So if you're interested in seeding, you're interested in getting some live roots into the soil. That keeps erosion down, keeps all of your topsoil from running away and leaving you with only subsoil. Those living roots, they actually create an ecosystem in the soil that it's a virtuous cycle. I'll leave it at that. We don't have a lot of time to go into the details here. So the next principle of soil health is to minimize disturbance. So if you don't have to till, don't till. And often you don't need to till. You may only just need to, you know, to actually cultivate, you know, really lightly in that top inch or two of soil. You don't need to go 8 inches down for a lot of your planting needs. Maximizing diversity. That diversity is all realms. That's plant, animal, your soil organisms. Diversity is basically great insurance. And then maximize your soil cover. So if you can't have living roots in the soil, meaning plants covering your soil, mulch is your next best bet typically. So whatever you can do to keep bare soil from just being exposed to the wind and water and you know, erosion and temperature fluctuations that are going to really like be hard on the soil. And you know what, yeah, okay, so moving on. Okay, so to actually do your soil prep and seeding, you have some goals. There's a million ways to do anything. Just keep the goals in mind, and for your situation, that will help inform what the actual, you know, the actual approach that you take is going to be. So the major goals to keep in mind are minimize soil disturbance, plant your seed under that 1/4 to 1/2 inch of soil, and then minimizing weed growth. For, you know, how do we get to these goals? So, oh, sorry, my reading got weird. Okay, so there's a few different methods. I talked briefly about drill seeding. That's really tends to be for a larger scale. You know, you're gonna usually need specialized, well, you need specialized equipment, possibly a tractor, possibly land that you can actually move these bigger implements on. But if you can do it, it's fabulous because it's one pass. You don't need to disturb the soil nearly as much, and you don't need as much seed because your seed can be more accurately placed. So drill seeding is fabulous if you can do it. If you can't, no problem. We can broadcast seed. I just will note that I don't know if most of you are in La Plata. Your conservation district is a good place to check and see, you know, if you are interested in trying to rent a drill seed. Southwest Ag out in Bayfield is one place you can do that, and the conservation districts also rent this type of equipment out as well. So just so that you know that. But if you can't drill seed, broadcast seeding is basically any other method that gets, you know, flings the seed out there. If you're going to be broadcast seeding to get better germination, you're going to want to first do some sort of soil prep, which might just be taking a rake and leveling out the soil. Or if you have an ATV, you can put a chain link fence on the back of that and drag it along the soil to kind of like, loosen that top bit of soil. So then you can then go and seed and then go and rake again to get that 1/4 inch of soil covering your seed. After you do that raking, then seeding, then raking, you if you're able to lightly tamp or roll the area, that will help increase the seed to soil contact, which will help give you better germination as well. So as far as bed prep is concerned, unless compaction is severe, focus on making that top inch of soil friable or loose, loose enough to move over the seed. Tilling might be appropriate for some situations. It's just best avoided when you don't need to do it. On the small scale, no, sorry, that I don't need to say that. I guess the other thing to note is that we don't tend to recommend putting straw over your seedings in most cases, because straw can bring a lot of weed seeds into a situation. And remember, that third goal is to minimize weeds as much as you're able to. Okay, so So after you've planted your seed and the soil temperature is right for the seeds to actually germinate, you're going to need to be doing your watering. So for watering, you really want during that first month to be keeping the ground consistently moist but not soggy. So wrung out sponge is usually what folks say. And it's in that first month when all of that root development's taking place. So you'll notice on the slide here that those roots are forming before you're seeing anything happening above ground. And I think it's really important to know what's going on below ground. So I highly recommend after you plant your seeds to start digging little holes and start seeing how those roots are developing. Start looking to see how deep down they are in the soil. And then that's going to tell you how you need to do your watering. I can't tell you apply this much water for this amount of time because every single situation is so different. Your sun, your wind factors are all so different. The capacity of water to move through your soil is different. So you need to look at your situation and determine for yourself how much to water. The goal that you're trying to get to there is that you want to water deeper than the root is and let that top few inches of soil dry out so that those roots are, they're encouraged to grow deeper. If you can grow deeper roots during this first year, then you'll have more resilient plants for the rest of their lives. So even if you have a dryland situation, if you do have access to supplemental water during that first year, especially the first few months after germination, it's great to be able to make sure that those roots are getting the water that they need to grow nice and deep. So I guess on a timeline, I will say when you're first seeding, because those roots are super short, you're just going to be watering pretty frequently, but not very deeply. And then as those roots grow longer, you're going to be watering less frequently, but more deeply. Okay. Okay. A word about weeds. So seeding alone is not going to be enough to manage your weeds. You're going to need to be doing other control practices as well. A lot of those practices should be done before you actually do your seeding. So that might be, cutting down the plants, making sure that your weeds aren't going to seed, both before you do your seeding and afterwards. For some folks, that might mean spraying. Do be aware in that case of potential herbicide seed interactions. We don't give advice on herbicides because it's just not our field of expertise. You're going to want to talk to the folks that deal those products to understand which ones you can apply that won't impact your germination for your specific situation. Know that weeds absolutely will outpace the growth of your intended plants the first year that you do your seeding. But I promise you it will get better. It will get better in particular if you're able to mow fairly regularly during that first season or even 2 seasons, about every 2 to 4 weeks, depending on conditions, to keep those weeds from going to seed. That's going to be a really important way to manage them. And then how to mow, we'll talk about in the next slide here. So as I said before, for many perennials, it takes at least 2 years for the plant to become fully established. So bear that in mind, so that you have reasonable expectations for your stand density and, when you're actually going to start seeing flowers blooming. Know that if you maybe most of you aren't doing pasture management, but like if you are, you're going to want to keep animals off of that planting for the first year, because they do so much tugging and things that these undeveloped roots can't really like handle yet. You'll get a much better pasture over time if you can not utilize it that first year. But mowing's okay. It's different because you can manage the height that you're mowing to. And you want to keep your mowing higher than the growing center of the plants that you have. So for most of your plantings, that's going to be 5 inches high will be safe, a safe height to mow your plants so that you're not negatively impacting the plants that you seeded there. And it will keep most weeds from going to seed as well. So mow it at about 5 inches or so. Okay, next. Okay, so I think it's good to understand that reseeding or overseeding is a lot more challenging than starting a whole field from scratch or a whole area from scratch. Sometimes it's necessary, but just be aware that you're at some disadvantages and that it's hard to get seed under a 1/4 inch of soil when you've got other plants that are in the way there, and you don't necessarily want to damage those plants to do your next round of seeding. And then there's some plants too that they've got allopathic properties, which means that they actually send out chemicals that will inhibit other plants from germinating. So again, it's not impossible, but know that if you can avoid it, it might be best to try to avoid it. If you do have to overseed rather than kind of starting from scratch, a no-till drill is a fabulous resource for doing that. Mowing or grazing that existing vegetation first, so that you're kind of like taking whatever keeps that seed from getting that good contact with the soil. You're going to want to take that out of the way. So then, after mowing or grazing, you'd want to rake up that debris or harrow if you're using equipment. And then you're also going to want to use a much heavier seed rate than you would for planting from fresh. Okay, so let's see. The last thing to note, I think that might be it. No, that was it. So I have no idea what time it is. I hope I left enough time for questions though. So please fire away.
Great. Thank you so much for your very thorough presentation. That was great information. Can you stop sharing the screen and we'll go back to everybody because there was a couple questions and thoughts that came through. So Bruce, if you look at your chat there, he had a couple of comments. One is, would a cool season perennial compete better against a cool season annual like cheatgrass than a warm season like blue stem?
Exactly. Yes. A warm season is going to be dormant during that time that the cheatgrass is growing and doing all of its stuff. So absolutely. And you're going to want something that it's only going to be, that cool season perennial is only going to be competitive after it establishes. It's not going to be competitive when they're first both like germinating, because the annuals will grow so much faster than the perennials.
Great. And then he also mentioned, Bruce did, that he's used that Foothills native mix. And going back to what you said, he said it was slow to get going for 2 to 3 years, but then this last year with the heavy snowfall, it grew very tall, 12 to 18 inches. So wheatgrass in the rice grass.
Yeah, that's gonna depend definitely on the water availability. During a dry year, plants will stay much shorter, and then during a really wet year, they can kind of take off. It's almost like you have different plants depending on the conditions that year.
And Bruce, do you want to add any more about that? And was this area that you had treated for removing ladder fuels, or was it after fire mitigation, or was it just a patch that you used this seeding, or how big was the area you used it on?
Basically, we used it all the way around the house, and this was after construction. So, um, yeah, it took about 3 years before it started to fill in pretty well. But for fire mitigation, uh, with that kind of height growth, we had to, and at least most of those species are cooler season grasses. Um, so they really go well in the cooler season. By mid-July, they were dried out. We had to do a lot of mowing around, that zone 1. So even though those were most years they're relatively short, but you get a year like last year with lots of soil moisture, they really grew.
Yeah, that's a great point. Really, for that, those for zones 1 and 2, we want to keep them mowed to 4 inches or less, usually for reducing fire risks. Do you see, Kendra, did that affect any of these recommendations that you give, or is it good
It
to
should
mow
be
it?
fine. 5 inches is kind of an average. 4 to 6 is the usual recommended range. So yeah, 4 inches should be fine for most things.
Great. Does anybody else have any other questions? You can go ahead and unmute yourself or throw it in the chat.
I have a question. I have, we cleared all around for about 4 or 5 acres around our house and bought a ton of seed from you guys. And we have no irrigation water. We are completely dry land. So we picked, I can't remember what the mix was, but it was 70 pounds of whatever grows the best with least amount of water. And so for 3 years now, we've scattered it all around our property and still nothing is growing. And we've tried it under the snow. We've tried it on top of the snow. We've tried it in the middle of the snow. We tried it in the spring, in the fall, and we just keep scattering it and nothing is really happening. Should I go out there again should I try and rough up the soil again this year, or should I go and do it on top of the snow this time? I'm not sure. It's more personal.
Yeah. So have you actually been able to get that, 1/4 inch of soil coverage during any of those times of year where you've been seeding?
I think so, because the first thing we did was we took, as you said, the ATV with the thing behind it with the chain link around, and we kind of pulled everything up. And we had originally had someone come in with a bulldozer and remove a lot of trees and things just for fire mitigation. So this was sort of stage 2. We thought, let's have some. Your first picture of that beautiful field with all the purple flowers was like my dream of, oh, this is what it's going to look like. And pretty much it looks a lot like dirt still. So, and with a lot of thistle that I pull out every year by the roots, which is not that fun. But I'm just wondering about suggestions. We're about 71 or 7,200 feet in Dolores between Narragansett and McPhee. So not too far from Pleasantview, really, but just not having a lot of luck with any of this. And I've tried, I don't know, a few different things. So should I try roughing up the soil a little bit more or just leaving it?
Yeah. So if it's good to know if like you're just not getting germination, period. Sometimes things will have germinated, but then they didn't have enough water to support a root system. So then they'll just die off. And it's good to know if like, okay, if I'm not getting germination in the first place, and obviously my issue is going to have to do with the application method or the timing. It sounds like you've been trying a whole bunch of times.
3 years.
Yeah, that I would say in order to troubleshoot that better, I would recommend calling into us. That way we can spend some time with you on it, because it's going to take some figuring to get to what is going on there. A lot of the time, I'll tell you, like at least 2/3 of the time, it's just that there's not enough water when the soil temperature is right. And I know for a fact these last few springs have been like really hard for dryland seedings to germinate, because the soil, like this last year, the soil was so cold until all the moisture had already evaporated and been driven away by the wind. So by the time the soil had warmed up enough for things to germinate, there wasn't enough water. So like that has become more frequently the case each year. It used to be that conditions were more favorable for dryland seedings, but the trend is trending away, away from that right now.
I think that might be the issue. Just that sounds like something. Bruce, you mentioned that after 2 or 3 years, yours is getting better. Have you been watering it, or is it natural?
Well, we actually watered that first. We did a fall plant on that or seeding on that, and again raked it in, and then I watered it. It was let's see, that was 2014, so it was relatively dry. So we did do some watering for about the first 2 weeks, just to make sure it got in there well. Then we started to get some fall, moisture coming in. So, but so we did have some pretty good 2015. You could see the little stuff coming up, but pretty much it's been on its own ever since that first fall. So we did try to water it in that first fall. I had an excellent, before we actually built the house, we put in the septic system, and I did a November, December with 3 or 4 inches of snow, scattered that same mix, that foothills mix out there, and got a tremendous spring crop of good grass, and it's held. Now we've had some mustard invade it pretty badly, but in the dry years, but overall it's held really nicely.
Hey, Bruce, if you
and I recommend that foothills mix to the people that I work with. I'm a forester, and so I do. We have been doing some logging in some places, and we use that foothills mix on landings and skid trails.
I was going to say, we are looking for photos of our mixes grown out. So if there's any interest at all in sharing some photos of the foothills or any other mixes that you've grown out on your property, I'm actively searching for those right now. So thanks.
I'll see what I can do.
Okay.
Any other questions? I thought it was interesting when you were talking about, what we look for fire mitigation, or what we're looking for. The erosion control is a big thing. If we get rid of ladder fuels, a lot of exposed earth, and that is a big concern for a lot of people, the erosion control. And then the low flammability, but the high rebound, that was something I didn't always think about. But I think that's true. Like if something were to come through, we want it to come back and hold that soil in as quickly as possible, without just weeds coming through. So some of the, the foothills mix or some of the other ones, for true, is that high rebound part of those species as well, or is there some specific ones that you could recommend?
Yeah. They are actually. It's easier to get information on that rebound actually from the the national fire metrics that they do than it is to get on the low flammability part of it itself. So yeah, the Sandberry bluegrass is one that tends to have like really high rebound, as does the rice grass. The slender does if the fire burns at a particular time of year, but it has less rebound if it burns, I think, during the spring than if it burns during the summer or the fall. And yeah, on the whole though, those plants do have good rebound.
Great. Anything else for Kendra? Okay, well, yeah, Kendra, if you want to send me those slides or a PDF of those, and we'll have this recording up and we can share with others, because I'm sure a lot of people will be interested in hearing more about this and the possibilities they have, especially when it comes to if they've done mitigation on their property or right around the house and keeping it lower wildfire risk when they do mitigation.
Yeah, and I just want to say for anybody else with any questions, please give us a call. We're there Monday through Friday, and we're happy to walk through whatever your specific situation is, because there are so many variables, and you know, there's no one size fits all for folks. So
Right.
thanks for letting me chat with you. I'm sorry I went over.
No
the time
worries. It was
open
great.
too.
No problem.
Yeah, very interesting.
Well, thank you all. You have a good rest of your evening.
All right. Thank you so much.
Cheers.